Welcome, everyone. I think we're ready to begin. This is John Eikenberry kicking us off, and welcome to this Peers Reimagining World Order Project Colloquium today, a book talk really, by our friends and colleagues, Alex Cooley and Dan Nexon. So I'm going to simply introduce them and then turn it over to them. They will speak for 25 minutes or so together. And then we will have a conversation, and we will start this off, myself and my two colleagues in the program, Tolya Levshun on my left and Chika Tanuka on my right. And the three of us will start off the conversation, then we will open it up to Q&A. So you will be invited to submit questions, and our intrepid authors will navigate your questions through the end of the session. So it is a pleasure to welcome and introduce Alex Cooley, first professor at Barnard College and director of the Columbia University Harriman Institute, written widely on international relations topics, Central Asia, great power politics. And his co-author, Dan Nexon, professor at Georgetown University in the government department and in the School of Foreign Service, former lead editor of International Security Studies Quarterly, I should say, and who also has written widely on many topics of international relations theory and debates and theories about international order, and an important book on order and change in early modern Europe. So we're very, very happy to have them here. I think Dan will start, and so the chair is now turned to him, and he will talk for a while, then Alex will take them to the end of their presentation. Dan, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm going to start up a presentation, and I want to be clear that if something doesn't look right, you're seeing like weird floaty formatting windows, or it's too small, let me know as soon as possible so that I can fix that.
Sorry, I just looked at the chat from Kim Worthington, who said we are only seeing one screen. Professor Eikenberry, is everything fixed now?
Can you see, are they able to see everybody now?
Everything okay?
I mean, if they're in, I don't know how.
Looks fine. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right, everybody's seeing a big, are you all seeing a sort of a whole bunch of faces on the side?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to, okay. You'd think that after doing this for 2 months of teaching this academic year and a month and a half last academic year, we'd get it right, but here we are. Okay, all right, well, thanks again, and thanks everybody for coming. We're going to be talking about some arguments out of our book, Exit from Hegemony, which came out in April. And as you can see, the cover at least might have an expiration date, but I assure you this is not primarily a book about Trump. But specifically what we're going to focus on today is an aspect of our argument that deals with the kind of mechanisms and dynamics of order contestation and how they relate to power transitions. So it's a slightly different spin. If you've seen us present on this book before, similar arguments, but a slightly different spin. So I'm going to begin with an overview of the main argument. So I'm just going to start out by telling you, this is what we say in the book. Then I'll move specifically into the mechanisms of order contestation, after which point Alex will pick up with some examples. And I don't think we actually have any implications that aren't inter alia, but in the Q&A, I'm sure we'll be happy to talk about some implications of the argument. So this is the book, yay. Our sort of central argument, our kind of big takeaway, which seemed more radical when we were writing this, seemed more radical when this project was gestating about 10 years ago. But one thing happened to another, and it took us a while to actually publish. But anyway, our argument, which may be more banal now, is that U.S. global hegemony is over. That the process of erosion of U.S. global hegemony is actually quite far along. So if you're one of those people who thinks that Biden is going to right size everything after Trump messed up a bunch of relationships, or if you think that Biden's going to screw everything up after Trump finally got us right on track, they matter, but they're not going to matter for this fundamental issue. It's gone. And fundamentally, the reasons are rooted in very familiar arguments to international relations scholars, or the kinds of arguments you're seeing every day on the op-ed page. The fundamental reasons are rooted in power transitions. They're rooted in the shift of economic and now military power away from the United States, both the rise of China, the sort of reemergence of Russia as a pretty solid second-tier great power, but also general diffusion of economic capabilities away from the United States and Europe, and which is something that's been going on really for quite some time. Now, Trump, in our view, is an accelerant, and he's a symptom, but he's not the fundamental cause of these dynamics. So our argument focuses on, sort of organized around three exits, three ways in which we are exiting from hegemony. The first is exit from above, which is the way that great power challengers, Russia, China most notably, are re-engineering and are increasingly able to transform international order and to eat away at the infrastructure of US hegemony. There's also exit from below. These are weaker states who are responding to new incentives and new opportunities by leveraging their ability to play patrons off against one another and leveraging the diffusion of power in ways that give them more bargaining room and more influence than they had, say, 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And then we have counter-order movements. This is exit from within, which we include both, and we'll talk more about this later on, but we include both the sort of rise of far right and far left movements that are explicitly oriented towards transforming international order and occasionally even get into power. But we also include here the policies of the Trump administration, which we view as an accelerant of exit from within, although there are longer term things about domestic and international policy that are also causing exit from within. But in particular, as you'll see later, we locate Trumpism and the particular wing of the Republican Party represents as an example of this broader counter-order dynamic. The main other takeaway is that, the Thucydides trap may or may not be a thing, and there are past global orders that have transformed, or international regional orders that have transformed through these big knockdown hegemonic wars, but we don't think that's actually necessary. So you can end hegemony, you can end hegemonic orders without the sort of big bang, the gestalt, the drama of actually having, a sort of World War II or World War I or a Napoleonic War or whatever. So in particular, we focus on order contestation. And today that's what we're focusing on. That's what I've said. So I want to talk a little bit about some concepts and some terms related to order contestation. So for begin with, how do we conceptualize international order? This is something that you kind of always have to define at the beginning of these arguments, or at least you should. A lot of times when we talk about international order, whether in in policy analysis or in international relations scholarship, we don't really define what we're talking about. We have a kind of, we often do this kind of, we know it when we see it, the pornography standard. But in our view, international order is really big. It is essentially a way of talking about relative stabilities and patterns of interaction that produce predictability for states. Orders can be very warlike, they can be very peaceful, but because it's sort of kind of everything, and indeed there isn't really even, in our view, one international order, although we'll talk as if there is. There's actually kind of aggregates and interlocking international orders at the regional level and in particular issue areas. But because it's so big and messy, we really don't think there's one right way to talk about it. So it's sort of like choose your own analytics, and these are ours. We think about order as composed of an architecture. Those are the rules, norms, and arrangements that you often see talked about. This is straight out of some of John's work. These are the things that you often see talked about as international order. Some scholars argue that this is international order. It is these rules, norms, and arrangements. Other people argue that that's sort of, but regardless of whether or not they agree or disagree, we think that it's best to think about this as part of international order, think about it as the architecture, kind of like the design principles, whether those are deliberate or whether they're emergent. But we also think that people pay less attention to. John's a good exception here, but nonetheless, people in general pay less attention to what we call the infrastructure of international order. And these are the networks, the routine practices, the forms of joint action and interaction that kind of happen all the time in international politics. And they're the glue that holds together international order. They also undergird international order. And they're actually particularly important when we talk about US hegemonic order and US hegemonic ordering, because the United States has, more so than a lot of powers in the past, built a hegemonic order that is very much composed of the creation of dense networks with various kinds of allies and partners and institutions. Our view is that these are mutually implicating. The architecture shapes the infrastructure, and the infrastructure shapes the architecture. They come together in various kinds of instantiations, like international institutions, which are places where you can see both that architecture and that infrastructure at work. But because they're mutually implicating, it has some interesting implications for contestation. One of which is that you can actually have contestation over the architecture that implicates the infrastructure, impacts the infrastructure. So states or other actors can go in to try to change rules and norms, and the strategies and tactics that they use can transform the international infrastructure, the international ordering infrastructure, or they can go in to sort of change that architecture in ways that directly disrupt or build alternatives to that infrastructure. But similarly, the infrastructure can change the architecture. So you can get transformations that just have to do with shifts in practices, whether deliberate, really thought through, or just changes in policy, or shifts that aren't really targeted even at a changing order. States may go out and build a lot of new ordering infrastructure just because they have the resources and they want the influence. And they can, whether they intend to or not, wind up having fairly profound effects on the architecture through that contestation or alterations in infrastructure. Overall, we like to think about this as a kind of ecology metaphor. We'll get into that more at the end, but this is one way we like to talk about international order in the aggregate as kind of creating an ecosystem between the infrastructure and how that locates states, how those networks position and relate states to one another, and in terms of the ways that that rules, norms, and arrangements further structure how states kind of where they are and where actors are, and how that can channel contestation in particular ways. So, okay, logics of contestation. What we're talking about with order, that we think that contestation over both the kind of high-level rules and norms and over infrastructure itself can have profound implications. So let's go a little bit deeper. So the animation is out of sequence, but what you should be seeing on the left, if I had tested this part of the slide properly, is you should see two terms for order, and they'll show up eventually. One, or order contestation. One is the concept of brokerage, and the other is the concept of wedging. We think that almost all order contestation, indeed almost all power politics, uses some combination of these two strategies. And so some examples of kind of wedging and brokerage strategies. So one example is the emergence of something we'll talk about later, order inoculation strategies. These are ways that states can deploy what we call brokerage and wedging strategies in order to protect themselves from pressure from international ordering mechanisms, institutions, norms. You can also get ways that you can combine wedging and brokerage to encourage counter-order movements abroad, to try to disrupt the capacities of other states, or to try to break up ordering institutions that you don't like. And you can also use these kinds of wedging and brokerage strategies to woo strategic partners, to try to disconnect them from some of their existing allies, and then try to reconnect them into your own kind of alliance or partnership systems. So yeah, I knew they would show up eventually. Let's go on to the mechanics. So if you have any basic familiarity with some of the work we're drawing upon, or some sort of network analysis, you know this already. But wedging, more or less, is any strategy, that is aimed to cut, sever, or wedge apart ties between states or other actors. So there are multiple possible instruments you can use to break apart an alliance, a partnership, a friendship, whatever scale we're talking about. You can use carrots, You can use incentives to try to disrupt that relationship. You can use sticks, you can threats of coercion, threats of force, threats of sanction, or you can use a mixture of the two. But no matter whether you're using more coercive or more friendly, as it were, instruments, whether you're trying to induce the end of that relationship, somebody to leave that relationship, some state to leave that relationship, or trying to coerce them into it, the goal is to break up that tie. Now, I already sort of made this clear through my examples, but the wedging strategies can operate at any scale and between any kind of actor, and this will become important. This is actually very important in what's happened to U.S. hegemony right now. Can operate at the interstate level, at the domestic level. Between states can try to wedge apart the domestic coalitions of other states. Non-state actors, non-state movements, transnational movements can try to wedge apart the relations between states or between domestic coalitions. So you can do this kind of stuff at any kind of level. Power transitions exacerbate wedging strategies. These kinds of strategies are always around. Order's always being contested through them. But power transitions exacerbate them because they mean that more actors have resources in order to offer those carrots or engage in those or deploy those sticks. Power transitions also tend to increase the sort of receptivity towards revisionist sentiments, and that also makes wedging easier, right? You have more actors during power transitions who tend to be unhappy, start growing unhappy about aspects of order. And this actually gets us into brokerage, which is where we are next. Now, brokerage is the opposite of wedging. Brokerage is when you link up previously unconnected social sites. And one of the big aims of brokerage, creating a brokerage relationship, is to put the actor that's doing it in the position of being a broker. Because if you are the conduit for relations between other actors in the security or the economic or the aid domain, that gives enormous amounts of leverage over those relationships and enormous amounts of advantages in terms of information flows and being able to use those relationships or manipulate those relationships. So brokerage is often done for the purpose of not just creating new ties, which can produce new resources, what we call domestically between individuals, social capital, but social capital among states and other international actors, but also to create these particular kinds of positionalities. But they can also be used to link up multiple states. This is what happens in multilateral cooperation. Is you try to link all the actors together. You're trying to maximize kind of institutional resilience, but also social capital and interaction in ways that build relationships. So you can do that, even though that erodes that brokerage position. Now, one of the things that's really important that happens during power transitions and the way that brokerage starts becoming a really key mechanism for the stuff we're talking about is that during periods of robust hegemony, there's only one actor or coalition of actors who are capable of providing a lot of kinds of things you see in patron-client relationships, like economic aid, like security guarantees. And so you have a very kind of lockdown relationship based on some sort of goods provision. When you get more economic, when you get power transitions and military and economic capabilities start to diffuse or change, that opens up the possibility for multiple patronage. This means that you have new actors on the scene who can provide those same goods. And that puts that increase in possible patrons actually puts weaker states in a new position of power and influence, all things being equal. It gives them exit options. It allows them to diversify their portfolio and reduce dependency in general. And even if they don't exit or even take on additional kind of goods from other patrons, the ability to threaten exit gives them more power in that relationship, and particularly more influence over that architecture, the rules and norms of international politics. So we kind of can combine these in various ways. I want to blow through these really quickly because I'm already taking a lot of time, but we have sort of two basic categories for thinking about how order contestation works. And the language here I know is confusing, and that's my fault. But we have what we call order contestation, which is ways of contesting aspects of order from within kind of the incumbent institutions. So, if you're going to have a floor fight in the UN over a UN resolution, that's order contestation. That's what we would term specifically to be order contestation. And wedging strategies in that kind of order contestation involves things like disrupting existing coalitions that support those existing rules norms. But wedging can also be occurred through what we call alternative order building, And that's creating new kinds of institutional arrangements outside of the existing ones that can be used to provide goods and other kinds of patronage, to offer those carrots and potentially to wield those sticks to break up existing relationships. On brokering and on the brokerage side, it's the same thing. That you can when you have order contestation within existing institutions, you're building coalitions for changing rules, norms, and then you can also engage in brokerage through alternative order building. These things reinforce each other. I don't want to work through all the mechanisms, but I just want to show you some arrows to get a sense of what we mean here. That oftentimes wedging in one domain can facilitate brokerage in another domain. Alternative order building obviously gives more exit options, which makes it easier to build new ties within existing institutions, to build new coalitions, all that good stuff. So there are all sorts of ways in which, in practice, these kinds of strategies and tactics interact a lot, and they interact normally, and the pace and significance of these interactions increase during power transitions. So let's talk about that in practice. Alex?
Great, thanks so much, and thanks again for having us. Pleasure to be part of this project with John and Chika and Tolia here. So we're going to go through some empirical examples of some of these mechanisms at play in this sort of order contestation. And first, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the trajectory of some of the kinds of norms providers and the vehicles for the dissemination of liberal norms. When we think about the 1990s, especially, we had a lot of emphasis on transnationalism as a vehicle for NGOs to boomerang around states, to challenge states. There was a prevailing view that NGOs were more nimbler, sometimes they were even sort of cleverer, and that they were absolutely key in facilitating liberal norm dissemination in areas that were reluctant to do so, right? Hence the sort of term of Keck and Sinkink, activists beyond borders. What the real turning point that we see empirically is about the year 2005. 2004 for us is like peak liberal ordering, right? In 2005, we start seeing sort of downward indicators in terms of democracy indicators. We are at the peak of NATO and EU expansion, that great wave in 2004. But we also start seeing real steps being taken against NGOs. In part in Eurasia, this is a symptom or a result of the so-called color revolutions, the perceptions that in Georgia and Ukraine, in Kyrgyzstan, that the US and Western powers supported and fomented street unrest. In fact, it's now become, a kind of, a noun, a color revolutions for on the street protests. And so what we had was a wave of anti-NGO laws, right? An attempt by government to say, actually, we can pass restrictive legislations. In this particular case, it's the Russian Foreign Agent Law of 2012. The graffiti says foreign agent, loves USA. And then 3 years later, they also passed a undesirable organization law that criminalized association with groups like NDI, NRI, Open Society Foundations, and so forth. So effectively severing funding and political support for these on-the-ground actors, right? You actually can ground activists. And Russia's the most dramatic examples, but you've seen these laws passed in over 60 countries, depending on whether you're counting just registrations or foreign funding laws, or even technological restrictions, like in Ethiopia, where they banned the use of Skype among sort of NGOs, right? So this is a big sort of counter movement. Next one, Dan. Then on the great power contestation, the sort of, from, top-down story about China and Russia, for us, sometimes gets too stuck in the question of whether these countries intentionally are playing by the rules or not. And instead, we see a mix of strategies. On the one hand, we see the Belt and Road is not just an infrastructure project, but as I'm sure you all know, it touches on several parts of ordering, including setting regulatory standards, having implications for debt and development, UN voting patterns and behaviors and other quid pro quos. But one of the other things that we do in the book is that we show that over the last 15 years, we have a number of these kind of counter-ordering brokerage attempts to create new regional organizations in the security and the economic sphere that are led by Russia and China and both, right? And so on the one hand, we're getting a much richer, much denser kind of regional ordering fabric as a result of these regional organizations. But at this, so that's sort of a brokering dynamic. But at the same time, you're also seeing China use wedge strategies too, whether it's trying to pick off Greece out of an EU vote on sort of human rights, or cutting bilateral deals behind the EU Commission with EU members. Next one. And here is sort of a classic example that Dan was referring to, sort of using both in the UN. This is a map of UN Human Rights Committee. And this was the sort of so-called dual letters of last year. In green, over the Xinjiang re-education camps. In green, you see the sort of initial critics in the council of the re-education camps. And these are kind of, the core of the classic liberal order: Canada, Australia, Scandinavia, Western Europe, Japan. The US withdrew by the time the vote was taken. But then a few weeks later, China mobilizes over 50 countries to not only reject criticism of the camps itself, but also pronounce China a guardian and model defender of the human rights regime, right? And that sort of transformative moment. And then you see the sea of red countries there covers in some ways more continents and more territories than the greens. So it's unclear whose norms are actually prevailing in these UN bodies in some of these cases. So again, we need to look at both of these mechanisms going on at levels of sort of existing organizations, as well as the construction of kind of these alternative order institutions. Next. Order from below, we mentioned sort of weak states using the availability of patronage to push back against conditions they don't like and norms and rules they don't like and demand more stuff. This gentleman is called Kurmanbek Bakiev. He is, I don't expect anyone to know this, but he's the head, or he was president of small Central Asian Republic of Kyrgyzstan. In 2009, he initiated, in essence, a base bidding war between the United States and the Russian Federation over the future of the Russian base there. Now, eventually, Bakiev promised to close down the base in return for a $2 billion emergency loan package from Russia, took the first $300 million, wired over, then went behind the scenes, did a deal with the US to renegotiate the base at a much greater rent and to rename it a transit center as opposed to a military base. So he played the two sides off one another. And this led to sort of a sense, well, what? Russia got outbid again. Russia's a declining power. But the overall point is, Dan, go on, that this has been an increasing prevalent theme. Even Kyrgyzstan is one thing. You can sort of say, Kyrgyz Republic is within the Russian Federation's sort of, quote unquote, sphere of influence. But now we're seeing this kind of dynamic also with partners and countries that have traditionally been part of the liberal order, or certainly the US security system, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, who has actively sought to court both China and Russia in both the security and economic realms. We've seen that in Europe, with the open embrace, again, of China and Russia by leaders in the Balkans and so-called sort of populists like Orban. This sort of who gives the most aid to Serbia is a particularly interesting investigation by RFERL, because they polled the Serbian public, who gives the most aid to Serbia? 40% said China, right? In part as a function of this kind of very China-friendly kind of rhetoric. Well, in fact, it's by far over 90% of the aid to Serbia comes from the European Union, right? You have very few people, only 17% sort of thought about that. And so perceptions that goods are being substituted, in this case, I would say, and we would argue, is almost as important as the actual act itself. The Ukrainian crisis of 2014 can be understood as two competing attempts at order building. Ukraine wanting to join the European-oriented order versus Russia and President Putin trying to buy them off with promises of cheap energy and buying bonds and so forth. And in general, we have a section in the book that talks about the rise of multipolar populists. Why are so many populists appealing to notions of sovereignty, of security, of independence, of autonomy, of illiberalism? It's in part because they want to evoke alternative partnerships as a sign of nation building and popular sort of strength. And of course, and we know how pivotal the Ukrainian crisis was in terms of accelerating, many of these dynamics. Next one, Dan. Finally, we're going to talk about Trump.
You are voting for the only current leader in the free world who has got the guts to stand up and fight for the nation state, to fight for patriotism, to fight against globalism. You'll be voting for the only leader in the Western world with the real courage to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party.
That was Nigel Farage on the campaign trail with President Trump. And the point of that slide is to talk about these new forms of association and transnational brokerage that are happening right now. One of the striking findings in this Pew survey that came out about confidence in U.S. leadership. The thing that got the most headlines was the perceptions that U.S. leadership is greatly diminished as a result of President Trump and the pandemic. China didn't fare that well either, except there's a small section in terms of confidence in President Trump amongst European right-wing populist party members actually increased substantially across Europe, Spain, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, and of course, UK. Where you saw from 2016 a very close association and mutual encouragement and networking of the head of the Brexit movement, Nigel Farage, and Trump's campaign. Our point here is that the US executive, in particular the Trump administration, has itself enmeshed itself and tried to promote many of these counter-ordering illiberal types of associations with groups and parties within Europe who reject some of the very basic tenets of the liberal order, like the EU and NATO. Whether it's appointing ambassadors, like this gentleman to the Netherlands that was sort of had to answer for going to a fundraiser or hosting a fundraiser for a Dutch right-wing party, or whether it's in Hungary, an ambassador who very passively watched Prime Minister Viktor Orban kick out the Central European University, which was one of the greatest U.S. investments in the country. So that's one dimension, that the U.S. executive is an actual agent now in these illiberal transnational movements and these new types of contestations. Whether it's Putin's support for groups like, and Russia's support for La Liga in Italy, or Linke, the left in Germany. These are relatively small sums of money that are devoted to against anti-ordering types of parties. And then another example of a brokered movement, this is the World Congress of Families. This is an NGO that started by two Christian right organizations in the 1990s that has now morphed into a transnational network that promotes conservative and illiberal values, especially an anti-LGBT agenda, anti-reproductive rights. And you've seen the fusion of a lot of Eurasian oligarch money supporting this, along with the Christian right. In terms of the agenda setting, you've had meetings in places like Moldova, scheduled in Moscow and Budapest, where Viktor Orban gave the keynote address to this place. And actually, the last meeting was in Verona, where Salvini was the host. So our point here is that this kind of revisionism that we see, waves of the liberalism, if you want to talk about, they are coming from within, and they are both endogenous and they are being supported by actors outside. And historically, as the slide says, a lot of these revisionist states originate from subnational and transnational political movements, whether we think about contestation, especially in the interwar years, and sort of competing transnational ideologies, or whether it's even the dissemination of decolonization ideas and national liberation movements of the 60s and 70s. Next one, Nim. This is where we want to end, and sorry for going a little bit over. So this is drawn from the book. This is back to our ordering ecology here. It used to be the case, because we also have a slide of this in the 1990s, that the arrows went in one direction, from the United States to NGOs, to the UN, to the OSCE, and they impacted countries like Russia. No longer. What you see now is a far more messy, complex, contested ordering ecology, both in terms that Russia now is actively supporting groups like the World Congress of Families, the diamond there, which then has links to places like Moldova and Mexico and Hungary and Poland, countries once thought firmly in the Western camp. The promotion of GONGOs, government-registered sort of NGOs. But then we also see competing norms within these international institutions themselves. We talked about the UNHRC, the OSCE also sees this. And in fact, now in the United States, we have this clash in the executive itself, on the one hand, upholding commitments to liberal ordering, and on the other hand, the executive actively promoting a kind of illiberal sort of traditional values agenda. So the contestation is within, and it's a kind of a messier, denser type of ordering ecology. So thanks again for listening. We'll keep it there, and we'll take your questions and comments and critiques. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Alex. And this has been very stimulating, and I'm sure we're going to have questions coming from all directions. I think what we'll start out doing is have the three of us, as the co-chairs, each ask a question, and then we'll open it up. But Tolia, maybe you want to start?
Yeah, I can start us off. Dan, Alex, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed this. This is so very topical. The question that I want to put to you, it has a little bit of a domestic bent to it. I should perhaps make it clear that in terms of my own political proclivities, I did favor Senator Bernie Sanders during the Democratic primary. But with that disclaimer out of the way, I'm wondering to what extent the present crises of international order, and I know that the way that you use the term in the book, it's more a metaphor. It's not a tightly operationalized term, because you yourself don't like it. Find it a little bit misleading. But to what extent is the present crisis of international order of the United States' own making, in effect? We do have these structural transformations happening that would have happened presumably under alternative policies that different administrations might have pursued. At the same time, to what extent did the policies in particular of neoliberalism pursued by the Clinton administration in the 90s and the unilateralism of the Bush administrations in the early 2000s, which Obama only continued, to what extent did those policy choices, which were contingent choices, amplify and accelerate those trends? Or to put the question slightly differently and perhaps more provocatively, to what extent could a return, for example, to a policy of embedded liberalism and a policy of co-binding and restraint to have served the United States better in terms of preserving the multilateral order in the 90s? Thank you.
Alex, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll have a stab at it, and then maybe Dan, you can weigh in. I think the premise of the question, is correct in the sense that there are some, in hindsight, really self-inflicted, big wounds of sort of eroding both sort of power and authority, and certainly the three main ones are what we see, what we're usually identified. The global war on terror, which switched us not and disseminated across the world, emphasizing anti-constitutional or extra-constitutional norms as opposed to constitutional norms. The war in Iraq, which combined with the color revolutions equated democratization with regime change, right? And kind of what the Chinese and Russians now sort of view as kind of, this kind of radical chaos that's on the US sort of agenda every time it intervenes. And then, of course, the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which not only delegitimizes this Anglo-Saxon model of financial kind of capitalism for a lot of countries, but also, perhaps reluctantly, pushes China into a role of, if not global public goods providers, regional public goods provider. China does two huge regional loans for energy deals in Eurasia with Russia, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan that keep these countries afloat, and then it prevents them actually from having to turn to sort of Western lenders, and with Latin America, Ecuador, Brazil, and Venezuela. And so the Chinese would say, well, these were investments, right? In a time of crisis, everyone got what they want, but it had these kinds of ordering effects. So, you know, were all these sort of self-inflicted? Could the US have strung it together for longer? Probably. But at the same time, I think, you know, inevitably, you know, these sort of mechanisms, and especially the patronage monopoly, was going to unwind. And once that starts unwinding, because, you know, political creatures look for incentives and for domestic competition and sort of for new drivers and mechanisms, you know, I think there is, you know, there's a sense we would have gotten there at some point. But I do think there's been an acceleration of the unraveling, you know, caused by these sort of three streams. And again, I would say 2005 is when it starts. And I would say the period from 2014 onwards is very akin to the period from like 1990 to 1994.
Chika?
Thanks for a really stimulating talk. I wondered if you could just take a moment then to unpack some of the theoretical aspects, because you had a lot of concepts in the earlier part of the talk. So could you take a moment to just briefly situate your intervention in relation to other existing power transitions theories or hegemonic stability theories, what you find dissatisfying about those bits, what you're doing differently with your intervention. And then in light of that, because I'm a historian by training, I wondered if what you're saying about these theories means that we should also revisit some of the other historical moments of transition and rethink about those moments as well.
Yeah, this is, I'm going to hand it over to Dan here, because that's a good cue for.
Yeah, maybe you could take the second half if there's anything left. Yeah, that's a really great set of questions. And, you know, one of the things we need to work on as we perfect this version of the talk, obviously, is integrating the analytics with it. But so, I mean, I think that the main, you know, I think that broadly speaking, we agree that when you have power transitions, you have that those are hugely consequential for international politics, because they open up the door to contestation over order. They create revisionist sentiments, or at least they create the willingness to states become more willing to be able to take on, you know, to become more willing to accept costs in order to transform the international order or transform their position within it, which is, you know, really what revisionism is. So we agree kind of with that basic kind of proposition that power transitions are important. They're times of disequilibrium, and that they have pretty profound effects in hegemonic ordering. Where we disagree, I think fundamentally, is that we don't think that with again, a few exceptions and a growing number of exceptions. So I don't want to need to be careful here, because I think this is the way that the field is going, that we haven't paid enough attention to what happens during those transitions. So we tend to kind of focus on, there's an order, it's kind of inert, it's just kind of there. And then the hegemon's in decline. You have a challenger. Is there a successful political bargain with a challenger? Yes or no? No. Okay, we got a war. Yes. Things are supposed to be nice and dandy, but we actually don't have very many examples of that. So we don't have a very developed senses of what those positive power transitions look like historically. So for us, the politics of what happens during the transition are really important, and the focus on the sort of the kind of end game, right? You know, sort of confuse, potentially in some cases may confuse cause with effect, right? It may assume that the war is the cause of the end of the order, not that the end of the order is what's producing the conflict. The second big difference we have is we think that and this is where I think we have a more pointed set of concerns. We really think that traditional power transition theory and hegemonic stability theory, the very traditional hegemonic order theories, really neglect the role of transnational contention in these processes. I mean, it's almost completely absent. If you go look at some, you know, a classic work on the rise and fall of the great powers, Paul Kennedy's book, he sort of kind of mentions, when he's talking about the Spanish hegemony, he sort of mentions, oh yeah, and they're fighting these wars with these Protestants, right? As if it's just kind of an afterthought. when in fact, a lot of what's happening to the Spanish is the formation of robust transnational mobilization around contestation over order, in this case, religion. And it's those networks, it's those cross-regional and cross-state, what we now call state ties, that enable really effective resistance and create huge problems for many of the status quo and existing powers, right? That are the source of really kind of durable conflicts, the source of the Spanish getting bogged down in the Netherlands, which is sort of the key to the whole thing. So, and Alex mentioned a couple other examples of that, the way in which sort of we just, we haven't integrated the role of decolonization movements and national self-determination movements into our story about hegemony. We tell that story when we talk about the decline of European empire. So that's a massive transformation in international order, right? And most of what the traditional theories tell us to look at is just what the great powers are up to. And there are many more examples, I think, of these situations where we kind of really downplay down to the very fact that, as we mentioned in the talk, that even some of the sort of textbook examples of hyper-revisionist states, Nazi Germany, for example, that these are the results of transnational ideological movements. They're not perfectly aligned. In fact, they're often competing with one another, taking control of states, right? So it's not like the states just kind of hanging out and deciding that the order isn't nice. You have to have these processes of contestation, which are often happening at the subnational and transnational level, that are really kind of the sources of a lot of even the high politics dynamics. So that's kind of where I think we kind of break from traditional hegemonic order theory. We're much more interested in the kind of role that contestation about order, both by states and by non-state actors, plays in the trajectories and even plays potentially an endogenous process in the way that the power transition unfolds, or whether there's ultimately even a power transition at all.
Yeah, that's great. Can I just ask a question, then we'll open it up. You got me going with your opening line, Dan, about it's over, and that a Biden administration that tries to recreate some of the bargains of hegemony, it's too late, it's over with. And I just don't quite buy that argument. So I'm trying to figure out why. And I guess what I hear when you make your case, you show contestation, but there's contestation in healthy political orders and ones that are evolving and reforming. So that itself is not a coding of revisionism. In fact, if you look at counter movements inside of, we'll call it the American hegemonic order, there's a lot of stuff bubbling up that's trying to reform and reinforce. The Alliance for Multilateralism, 50 countries have, I think, led by Germany and France, and now South Korea and others, Japan trying to keep TPP alive, middle states, Australia, Canada, again, South Korea, countries that have a huge stake in this order, perhaps as much as, and feel they want to keep it, perhaps certainly more strongly than Trump does, but as strongly as its supporters inside of the United States do. So there's constituencies and stakeholders. And when you look at the American hegemonic order in the past, you don't see a kind of pristine American-led system. You see contestation all over the place, and you see pluralism and pulling and hauling. The 1970s, the whole architecture of hegemony was redone, making more room for others. So it seems to me that your theory of hegemony is kind of very Trumpian in that it's transactional. States are making these business arguments about whether this patron can give me more than that patron, where in fact the history is much more constructivist. It's a history of democracies inside of a very contested global order deciding that they wanted to affiliate with each other. And so I guess to bring this to a question, the question is kind of, when do you know that an order is breaking down and ending and not just transitioning? So the short version of the question is, what would surprise you? But because if I were to make a prediction about the future, I would say, yes, there's contestation and transition going on, but there's also renewal, and it matters what the United States does. The United States is endogenous, and that in 20 years, it's quite likely that several features of the global order will still be in place. I'll list them: the alliance system between the United States and Europe and East Asia. The Federal Reserve will still be the most critical feature of the world monetary system. Trade regimes with Europe and Asia will still be in place, where they may be stronger with the TPP, and there will be political alignments between all the major liberal democracies, which would be coded as tight and intense if, for example, they engaged in intelligence sharing with each other. Yes, China and Russia are outside, but they were outside during the golden era of American hegemony. So you can't make them causes of decline when they were on the outside looking in during the period when you had the most coherent liberal order. So when do I know, and when do you know it's over? And when it's not just a more muddling through outcome with a lot of states on the inside and some on the outside?
I'm going to quickly make a meta point, and then I'm going to hand it over to Alex. And actually 2 meta points. The first is that one of the things that John's done, and I'm going to praise John for a second. One of the things that he's done that's, I think, really important for our understanding of the 90s and early 2000s was to get us off the idea that the era of global hegemony, right? The unipolar era was really simply a function of American power, right? And so I think the critique he's making is important here, because what the 90s really were was a cartel among the advanced industrialized democracies, right? They were really, it was not that unipolarity caused hegemony, it was that hegemony made unipolarity possible by having states not want to go their own way, or having states not want to build up their own military capabilities after the Cold War. So I think it's an important critique, and I'm sure Alex will have more to say about that. Second point is that I didn't do the normal clarifications I do because I want to invite this debate. We are not arguing that the United States is not going to be the first, is not going to be the most powerful great power on the globe, right? We're not arguing that the United States is going to be relegated to some basket case. This is the Rome is not about to be sacked necessarily, right? Our argument is that U.S. global hegemony is over, right? So that the United States is not in the cannot go back to the kind of position it had through the mid 2000s, from the end of the Cold War. That's what's done. Right, the United States is now a competitive arrangement. Now, how much it wants to be a great power leading a series of suborders that are extremely powerful, right, and are extremely capable, that's up to the United States. That's up to U.S. policy, right? It's also up to the Europeans and a couple other important alliance partners, right? So, do we want to? Are we going to be in a position to have, to make policy choices like, really maintaining and like really doubling down on and improving and reforming and dealing with problems in our core alliances? Are we going to try to do market harmonization with some of the other great power, liberal democratic great powers, to allow that market share to once again kind of be dominant globally, right? We can do those things. And so it's not the case that the United States is not going to be probably the most important great power on the planet. It's just that it cannot get the kind of way it got. It cannot engage in the kind of ordering that it was able to do in 15 years ago, 20 years ago. That's the sort of core of our claims. Now, Alex, you want to answer some?
No, I think it's I think that's exactly the issue. It's first amongst many kind of thing. I think the only issue I would take, John, is I see a distinct pulling out of this and a more emboldened kind of stance by both China and Russia that I do think is significant, just in the sense that our metric for judging, I think their kind of order socialization has perhaps been a little too narrow, right? I'll take Russia, the case I'm most familiar with, right? The kind of, especially after the Georgia War, where Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and they humiliated themselves trying to get everyone else to recognize them. They paid off a couple of Pacific islands, and they got Venezuela and most recently Syria. And everyone said, well, Russia's a regional power. It's in decline. What can it do? And what you've seen since is a lot of Russian learning and an obsession with targeting the order, right? And so there's a really interesting thing. When Trump says, I'm the toughest on Russia you'll ever see, he's actually not wrong about some of the things he invokes, whether it's sanctions or selling weapons to Georgia and Ukraine. Number of red lines that Obama didn't cross. However, Where Putin really likes Trump is this in his view on world order, which the Russians feel, rightly or wrongly, right? I'm not in the business of telling countries what their national interest should be, is their number one national security and foreign policy priority, is to bring it down by any means necessary, whether that's buying countries off, which didn't work out too well for them, to now actually being a lot more opportunistic, doing things like interventions in Syria, Libya, moving into the Central African Republic with sort of these kinds of other types of mechanisms of sort of PSCs and sort of flooding social media once the French pull out. In other words, I think there's a real evolution in the instruments of order contestation that might not be sort of readily apparent. But I see no scenario in which a Russia or China is even going to sort of contemplate going along with the liberal order, as opposed to sort of try and transform it in every way possible. Sometimes following its rules, usually trying to change the rules further, and then setting up new mechanisms for doing it. So I think we are in a different world there. It's not just we're contesting within certain parameters of agreement, that the rules and the norms themselves are actively up for grabs and redefinition.
My point was just that the rise of Russia and China as competitors for international order could reinforce American hegemony. So
certainly it could. And that liberal sphere,
of American hegemony may just be started in that sense.
Yeah, and and then the other dimension of this, of course, and I'd be curious to get your take, is the question of now partisanship mapping under liberal ordering, liberal contestation. And I think that there is a danger that if we go in another cycle, that then the foreign policy consensus breaks down, and we have people like a Hawley or a Cotton who are sounding some of the same notes as Trump, with some of the same concerns, and then we get much more polarization on foreign policy. But that's a slightly different realm.
Bunch of questions, but I just want to say something here really quickly.
We actually have on the question that you asked, John. We have a follow-up from Harold James, so I thought we could start with that.
Is that okay, Dan? And maybe you can bundle it together.
Is that fine? So this is just about the question of whether non-state currencies provide a meaningful alternative to other financial institutions challenging American financial dominance. So, for example, John, to your earlier point about the Federal Reserve remaining a pillar of the global financial system going forward vis-a-vis the other state banks. What about non-state currencies, blockchain technology in particular? Alex, Dan, do you think that the diffusion of these non-state currencies provides a serious challenge to the American-led financial system or not?
I wouldn't say serious at this point. I do think the American financial system is, I think, one of the strongest existing sort of mechanisms. So I've no issue with that. But I do think that the sanctions regime and the use of sort of targeted sanctions and the overuse in some ways has created a consensus for trying to find pathways out of it, right? It used to be just the Russians were concerned about this, especially sort of post 2014. But increasingly, this is something China talks to Russia about, and that other countries who've been snagged in the dragnet of the sanctions are looking to sort of carve out exceptions, also on the Iran deal and so forth. So I don't think dollar hegemony is doomed anytime soon, but I do think that the justification for finding alternative solutions, because there is this broad recognition that American financial power can be crippling, that is going to push states to look for ways to countervail that. Although I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but I think the steps are in place that we hadn't seen before.
Thank you. So shall we take up the questions in order then? Chica, why don't you take us off?
Okay, so we've had a question about the different mechanisms of order change, whether you could go into a bit more detail. So the question is, can you speak more to how actors choose between order contestation and alternate order building, and then between brokering and wedging? Actors can do both simultaneously, and as you mentioned, they can be reinforcing. However, what are the mechanisms that determine what strategies actors might pursue for any given issue or time? One further complication I'm puzzling over currently is that actors can contest an order on a specific issue, but they try to create an alternative order on a separate issue. If that is the case, are they more broadly trying to overturn hegemonic order or to shape the existing order to their own interests? Does that distinction matter?
So let me start there. I think that's a terrific question.
Great question.
It's a terrific question. So one of the wagers that we make in the book, and I think it's a wager that Alex and I have been making for a long time, and it's something where if we're wrong, then everybody else is right, right? John's right, is that you can get, is that as aspects of international order get transformed or chipped away in ways that are not necessarily favorable to the maintenance of U.S. Hegemonic infrastructure, that can be weak. That can kick off. That can itself is weakening of U.S. hegemony, right? Both in the instance, but also in the knock-on effects to ordering infrastructure, right? And also that it is so that also that it also right. So it's both weakening in that sense, but it is, well, okay, it's just weakening in that sense. I lost my train of thought at boarding, went off station, but the whole, but what I'm sort of trying to say in essence is that you can get a kind of hollowing out of the mechanisms that the U.S. uses to maintain hegemonic influence, and that U.S. used to maintain hegemonic influence globally, without anybody really necessarily even intending to go like revisionist on the United States, right? Pursuing their own interests. So I don't think, I don't think China is necessarily out there to overturn the order in some sort of deep constitutive way. I think China has some visions of how the order could better serve its regime survival. Right. But the kinds of steps that you take then to defend your regime against what you perceive as threats from the politically liberal character of international order, those weaken the United States. Those weaken U.S. infrastructure. They create exit options. They make they create sort of international social capital and diplomatic ties that can be used in other contexts. They can wedge apart certain kinds of relationships, right? They can denudiate the effect of what had been dependency, say, on Western aid, right? Again, without any kind of necessarily intention to go out and not and overhaul the whole thing, as long as you are at best neutral on a lot of those kinds of ordering questions. So our wager is essentially that as you chip away, as you hollow out these networks and practices and diplomatic capacity manifest in that infrastructure, that you really are eroding U.S. the broader aspect of U.S. hegemony much more than people might recognize, and that there are hidden thresholds out there that, as we pass them, really involve very substantial reductions in U.S. influence. I think we've passed a couple of them, right? If you think about some regions of the globe, for example. Now, the second thing I would just make is that because I think this ties into that, in terms of mechanism, why you choose certain kinds of strategies, we don't have any kind of grand theory of that. There are actually people now, we're seeing a lot of work that is publishing on this topic. Right? When do you exit institutions? When do you try to leverage them from outside? When do you try to leverage them from inside? There's a lot of really good work popping up on this. So that's good because it lets us a bit off the hook. But the thing I would say is that a lot of this is endogenous to the order itself, right? So this ecosystem metaphor is, I think, pretty important. If you look at the way that China kind of interfaces with its alternative order building, the way that it builds this increasingly complex set of diplomatic and economic ties, a lot of what it started out doing was moving into what were essentially empty niches, right? Places where the United States did not have a huge strategic priority and didn't really care that much to compete. Right. And so this has had an effect. If you look at places where China has penetrated in Europe, some of which are getting some rollback and pushback, they're generally areas that were underserved, right, by Germany, the United States, by the EU, where there were gaps in public goods provision. Right. And so some of the choices that states make are kind of endogenous to where they are positioned within that order and kind of resources that they have, and how then you get kind of effects as they begin to cut into the order, how that creates self-reinforcement or shows them that certain things don't work very well or whatever. Russia, I think, is a very good case of this because a lot of the techniques that Russia's used sort of Russia's big on wedging, I think, because it doesn't have the resources by itself to do a lot of brokerage, right? And in part because the strategic environment is such that it has to break up tight US alliance systems, tight US institutions, if it wants to reduce what it perceives as a threat for them. So that puts a premium on wedging as a strategy. And a lot of what Russia does is sort of it developed a repertoire in part through inoculation strategies. A lot of things that Russia does now overseas, cooptation of parties, gongos, flooding the zone informationally, all that stuff was developed to shut down Western reformist movements and protests domestically. And that was kind of upgraded. So a lot of these things are kind of have this, even though I think there's a strategic rationality story, some of them are endogenous to the way that states are interacting with order and the way that these strategies work or don't work. And some of them I think are actually even kind of more contingent. They relate to kind of experimentation in techniques for preserving regimes or for pushing it back against liberal ordering domestically. So China has the Great Firewall, and that influences that influences then the way it thinks about exporting authoritarianism in terms of surveillance states and things like that. So, and doesn't not necessarily the way that when China goes to buy politicians, they're not using, they've just started trying to use the same kinds of techniques that the Russians have gotten much better at, frankly, than they are. But they may learn and they might adopt those techniques as well, particularly if they continue to see a threat from the sort of politically liberal characteristics of the order to the regime itself.
Okay, thank you. I will try to take these questions in the order that they were received in. The first one is from Peter Haas, and it's a little bit more of a deep theoretical question. Could you elaborate on the claim of co-production of architecture and infrastructure and give some examples of the co-production going both ways? Is the co-production universal in a deep sense, or are there just selective cases where one or the other influences and shapes the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one example off the top of my head I'm more familiar with, we don't discuss it at length in the book, but it's an example we give, is in terms of sort of the norms and rules that undergird the important infrastructure of the U.S. overseas military basing system, right? Where what we've seen is an infrastructure that's been absolutely vital for the maintenance of U.S. global, forward deployment and reach, maintaining hegemony, and yet the rules around basing, as Sebastian Schmidt's new book sort of look, have really changed the norms, where basing becomes codified in the 50s and 60s, and then as the norm of decolonization and sovereignty and liberation becomes much more contractual on the one hand, in its terms of its bargains, reconstituting this sort of new category of, bases being invited guests, right? Or being, multilateral sort of, presence, if you're in the case of sort of Italy and Turkey. These aren't referred to as American bases. And so what you're seeing now is an interesting mimetic attempt by the Russians and the Chinese to take many of these same forms, but without a full acknowledgement what the sovereign relations between the countries actually are, in the way that sort of, tortured the US for so long. So I think, basing is the norms and the rules undergirding it have been dynamic, have been subject to change. The US has gotten kicked out numerous times because just the rules were incompatible with domestic political pressures. But that infrastructure itself is a pretty distinct American phenomenon still, and it's pretty vital to the overall hegemonic presence.
Thanks. Next, we have a question from Harold James. Can you explain the chronology? Why is 2004-5 the turning point? Professor James thinks either 2003 Iraq or global financial crisis 2007-8 would be more obvious.
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess, I'll just go in. Sorry, Dan. As a Eurasianist, 2004, 2005 is a pretty peak year. And I'll say this is, first of all, if you just look at the US extended presence, right? 2005 is its peak. What do I mean by that? A bunch of former Eastern Bloc countries joining NATO. In fact, the Balts joining NATO in 2014. That's one dimension. The US basing presence in Central Asia, which between 2001, where it was accepted by Russia, had come to be perceived by Russia and China, right, as an attempt to exert influence in the region. That is when the US gets expelled from Uzbekistan and its presence in Kyrgyzstan starts to be contested. And so there's a kind of a security presence that starts to be rolled back. Then there's a normative presence, right? The pushback against liberal values. And for us, the most important is the conflation of democracy promotion and liberal norms with the intent to precipitate regime change, right? Once democracy promotion is viewed by these regimes in Eurasia as a security threat, not as a political nuisance, not as an annoyance, but as a bona fide security threat, a lot of other things happen. Security services get involved. They take extraterritorial and technological measures against dissidents. You get the anti-NGO legislation. You get active pushback. Alternative election monitors, like, no, we're going to bring in our own election monitors and they're going to tell us the election in Kazakhstan was super good, right? So you see a lot of these also sort of mimetic counter-ordering behaviors start to happen in that period. I would say it's sealed, certainly. I mean, 2003, plays into that. The insurgency in 2004 and 2005 gives this sort of impression of sort of chaos. And then I think the other sort of important, wave of events that we haven't talked about is the Arab Spring, and in particular, US and allied reaction to Arab Spring, which just underscores, I think, a lot of Chinese and Russian fears about the true intent of these places. Putin chastises Medvedev, having been so naive to abstain and grant NATO authority to go into Libya, so forth. So I think, in terms of just indicators, I mentioned sort of, if you, whatever you think of them, from Freedom House, Nations in Transit, every year since 2005, we've seen a net decline in overall trends and scores, right, with no exceptions. So I think, one final thing, in a reconstituted NATO and European Union, right, the concerns and the balance of power start shifting within these places, right? You start to get the former Eastern Bloc countries take a role in setting the agenda, right? So the Eastern Partnership for Ukraine, that its expansion leads to this set of unfortunate events in 2013 and 2014, is pushed by the new EU members, right? As a way of bringing in the so-called borderlands from Russia and contesting. So there's an endogenous change within the transatlantic institutions themselves as of 2004 that alters their presence, and I do believe makes them more threatening, from the Russian perspective.
Thank you. The next question that we have on the list is it's a little bit of a rough question. It's not clear exactly what the context of this is, so perhaps I can try to fill in the gaps here. And feel free to interpret it to your own advantage. Two parts, and this is basically about your theoretical framework in the book. What is the basic driving force that's causing these transformations in the shapes, architectures, infrastructures of international order? And I guess the relevant baseline here would be something like Robert Gilpin's claim that it's differential rates of growth that are the fundamental dynamic. So is there like a master variable or a set of master variables in your story? Could you've already touched a little bit on that? Perhaps could you make that a little bit more precise? And also, what should we expect in terms of the outcome of these transformations? Could there be a great power war, or if there is no war, as you say, what kind of equilibrium can we expect?
Alex, I keep on kind of choking on my question, so maybe you want to take this one?
Well, I mean, I think, the mechanisms in some ways are, the overarching practice of, brokering and wedging. But there's also, I think, this sort of, the main driver in a lot of the book is a kind of, mimetic order contestation, where a lot of the things that we used to associate with producing liberal ordering, and we would say, aha, Regional organization, we know those are good for democracies, right? And we'd have sort of a theoretical framework based on sort of, NATO and the EU that we would apply. Transnational social movements, right? Kind of liberal actors spreading universal norms. That we start seeing that, election monitors, right? Wanting to sort of undermine, kind of the sovereignty and keep sort of democratic norms intact. We start seeing that in this mimicry of a lot of these practices and actors and institutional forms, they start losing their substantive liberalism, right? And when that starts happening, we have sort of kind of three pillars of the liberal ordering system, right? Multilateralism and intergovernmentalism, right? On the one hand. On the other hand, economic liberalism, where you see kind of a real shift to sort of disembedding liberalism in the 1990s with some of the, consequences in 2008 of sort of complete financial power sort of run amok. And then sort of political liberalism. And the bet in the 1990s is that all of these things go together and they reinforce each other, right? What Tom Wright calls the convergence wager. And in fact, they don't. And sometimes they actually undermine each other, right? And so I think part of this dynamic of hollowing out is that we have not been attuned to seeing how the order itself is changing because we're assuming that these institutions and these practices operate the same way they did or are doing in sort of 2013 that they did in 1993, right? And these same actors and mechanisms are producing and generating and sustaining more illiberal outcomes now than before. So that's my kind of meta kind of narrative about the driving argument in the book. But we really also want to distinguish between these different pathways because it can't all be Gilpin. It can't all be differential growth. There have to be actors who get political benefits from doing all this, and then we wanted to, tease that out amongst these sort of three pathway dimensions.
Yeah, let me just add. Yeah, I mean the fundamental argument about what's the fundamental driver is uneven economic growth, right? I mean we're not saying anything radical or revolutionary. We're not trying to overturn that aspect of theories of hegemony. But one of the reasons why we don't come out and say we don't have a flow chart that runs through all of the kind of antecedent causation is because we're kind of agnostic on this stuff, right? I mean, in a sense, what might drive some of these dynamics to worsen? Well, you need certain kinds of conditions from a process tracing perspective. You've got to have alternative patrons for this really kind of a ratcheting up of the order contestation dynamics to occur. You've got to have actors who want to do it, right? And you've got to have, and a lot of times that's going to be driven by uneven growth, or it's going to be driven by something else that some endogenous or exogenous process that alters kind of the distribution of capabilities. But I'm not interested in, I'm not sure there's any singular causation for these things. And that's also a part of, I think, something to understand about the nature of this argument, which it's not as rigorous as a typical piece of social science would be for a variety of reasons in terms of kind of what it's aimed at. But in general, a lot of these issues, like, I don't know, right? I mean, we're interested in a set of mechanisms and processes and the way that they feed back upon each other and the way that they may be doing, the way that we think that those processes are unfolding in some really important domains in the last 10 or 15 years and right now. And there's a lot of historical contingency and specifics, right? So one of the things that I think should be really freaking us out, Alex alluded to, is and this is something that John Owen's work on Idiot and Clashes of Ideas points out is a real kind of issue if you're worried about conflict, military and non-military conflict, is we do have this increasing, not only do we have what everybody's familiar with that is coming to a head in a couple of days, enormous polarization in the United States, but that polarization has become increasingly isomorphic with polarization in other states, right? So that our right wing loves their right wing. I think it's actually a little asymmetric. I think the left is less effectively transnationalized. And that's something that Bernie Sanders was arguing we should do more of. But and so you have these sort of I think it's like it's a structural homology. There's an interesting piece about the way this worked to help in actually at the end of World War II, the way in which New Dealers became structurally homologous with certain kinds of coalitions within, say, France. So we're seeing this homology happen, which means that it's very hard for the United States to go after certain kinds of illiberal forces that we think are dangerous to its infrastructure, right? Without it being a domestic political battle, right? And so, like, if you talk about big reordering, it's all going to have to be informal because we can't pass treaties anymore. Right? We certainly can't pass big ordering treaties. You can't get to 2/3 in the Senate, and that's a constitutional requirement. So it's not, we can't get rid of the filibuster and solve this problem, for example. And so we're sort of hamstrung in a lot of these ways. It's no wonder China can proliferate all these new international organizations. All they have to do, they don't have a process like we have for doing it. And then since everything's informal, it's all vulnerable to being ripped up, right? Like the JCPOA or what have you. I mean, even our treaties are vulnerable to being ripped up too. But they're, so in a sense, this polarization that's happening is very worrisome. It's very worrisome because it means that, if you're going to go after some of these forces, they're going to have a 45 to 50, 40 to 45% of the US population is going to orient towards supporting them. That's very dangerous, right? The way we solved this in the 40s, well, in the 40s, it was more, the 30s and 40s was more complicated because we had Bolsheviks, Bolshevism, as Polanyi would say, and fascism. And we ultimately wound up with this kind of New Deal social democracy way of resolving it. And I know Biden has this idea that he's going to do that now, but it's more complicated, right? Because we have it is more of a kind of bifurcation, right? And so, I don't know how we deal with that. I don't know. The politics of that strike me as extremely dangerous for the ability of the U.S. to wield hegemony in a responsible way, to maintain the core of its hegemonic system, which is what I think we ought to aim for. It's extremely worrisome, the ability of the U.S. to tackle the way in which transnational networks are destabilizing U.S. democracy. And so those are the kinds of things that keep me up, and that I think make this less of an easy story, but they're also highly contingent, right? We can see patterns that are similar to these patterns of other, 1848 or the rise of, the first wave liberalism, the French Revolution, or we can talk about the Protestants and the Catholics, right? Or we can talk about, various clashes in the Chinese system between different, but we can talk about all those things, and there's the mechanisms and processes, there are some parallels, but I don't think that they, we don't have a unified theory of them. I don't think that's possible.
So do you want to just maybe pitch one last question? I know that we're coming to the end, so I think one more would be the limit.
Yes.
It's kind of fairly tractable.
We have quite a few here. I'm preferential to one particular question, so I'm going to go with that one. But this is a question about prognostications. I guess quite a few of these questions have been about speculations about the future. This one just pushes it a little bit further. What kind of normative principles do you see emerging on the international landscape as Russia and China and the other great powers step up to the plate in crafting these alternative institutions and creating coalitions, brokering coalitions around them? Would it be a sort of John has a wonderful term for this, kind of a simple Westphalian order, kind of very, very limited multilateralism with no distinctive normative purposes embedded in it? Or do you see rather clusters of alternative normative regions emerging in a more pluralistic system?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think we do have some evidence of the norms that are out there. They're embedded in different, also international regional organizations, the sort of counter norms. I wrote a little bit about this a few years ago, the JOD article. But I think the three main ones are sovereignty and security, right? Where threatening democratic actors are recoded as security threats, and also the offensive use of security services to go after dissidents and exiles overseas. That's been a normative change, right? And that's happened over the last 10 years. You're not safe anywhere, right? In terms of you're in exile. You saw that today, with the release of details of the fox hunt. And right, this is sort of China's anti-corruption norm is to combine it with extraterritoriality and going after people, right? So I think sovereignty and security is one. Civilizational diversity is the other, right? All civilizations are great. You're great. We're great. And so, there's no pretense of sort of universalism. And then I think the traditional values agenda has gotten a lot of mileage for Russia. They've taken it on, coalition with the Arab League, a bunch of sort of gongos and NGOs sort of waging on this. So I think, and also real alliances with the Christian right here. So I think these are kind of the three groups of sort of counter norms. I don't think any of them is going to be dominant. They don't aspire to universalism, right? I think instead it's going to be mixing and matching. And if you're Russia, you'll deploy one when it's expedient and another one when it's not expedient. And you know what? If you have a crummy election in Pennsylvania, they'll throw liberalism at you too, right? So I think there's, it's kind of a more of a fragmented kind of space here than any kind of one kind of counter or, illiberal kind of norm. That's sort of my take.
Just very quickly, I think our disagreement with John would be that we think there's going to be a lot of multilateralism out there. It's just going to be the alternative ordering infrastructure. It's going to look like it's going to remain the way it is. It's going to be, unless a lot of proactive action is taken by the United States and other advanced industrialized democracies, which is going to be denunciated of political liberalism. Right. So, it's going to kind of be this weird kind of funhouse mirror version where you do extraterritorial policing, but you're picking up dissidents and stuff like that, like the SCO model. The really interesting question now is what happens in the legacy institutions, the old, the UN, right? Where, and how much just showing up, which the Biden administration, if Biden wins, will presumably do, will stop some of the hemorrhaging. But there you see when the US kind of isn't playing the game, political rights, human rights get stripped out of things like UN peacekeeping mandates. And that's the kind of thing I think we're going to see. So I actually think multilateralism is awesome for a lot of these players. And I think there's a lot of elements of liberal economics that are great for them, particularly capital mobility. If you're a kleptocratic ruler, that's like the bee's knees, right? But so I don't think we're like, we have a piece that's going to come out after the election now in Foreign Affairs on sort of the future of liberal order. And our argument is that it's better to understand this as a mutation, right? Where you have elements of liberalism combined with new elements, new and some longstanding elements of illiberalism. The balance has shifted. The gestalt is new. So if we had, Bretton Woods 1 and Bretton Woods 2 and then slash neoliberalism, what we're kind of in now is increasingly kind of global, kleptocratic, oligarchic version of economic liberalism. And the populists love that. So there's a lot of buy-in for that. And that's where I am actually very pleased with the Biden anti-corruption agenda. And if he can get buy-in, if they can get buy-in from the EU, there's in Japan, there's some hope there for at least protecting us a bit from that stuff. So
that's great. I think we're going to end it there. One of the ideas in your book that I like, and I use it in my own work a little bit, is the notion of ecosystem or environment. That these are arrangements that create a kind of space that actors inhabit, and they want to have these features to that space that allows them to make choices, transactions, and so forth. And so you raise a good question about competing ecosystems and where the world goes in terms of the balance of the types of values and institutions that inhabit these particular ecosystems. So on that, I just would say thank you for inhabiting our ecosystem today, and hope that we can continue this. This has been very stimulating and great questions from our audience. And so on that note, we'll just thank you and look forward to the next occasion.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for tuning in and for your great questions. Sorry we didn't get a chance to address all of them.
Yeah, we didn't address Peter's very well. Will has an amazing, difficult question. You should go out and read his new EJR piece, which is incredible and has informed my thinking on stuff we've already written. So thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.